Have you ever found yourself trying to write a short story only to realize that you've actually just started a brand new novel again, and you had no idea how to handle the short form? Well, my friend, let me teach you how you too will be able to master the short form by the end of this video.
Welcome to the Plottery, where I teach writers just like you how to make storytelling become second nature.
Hello everyone, I'm Shar. I'm a fiction writing coach and I help writers just like you go from quite a vague idea to a cohesive plot outline. Now today we're going to be talking about short stories. If you've never tried your hand at short stories before, maybe that's the reason why you're at this video. Or you might be someone who's attempted short stories before, but you kind of felt like they were a little bit off. Maybe there was something wrong with the structure, or maybe you just weren't satisfied with them, or the most common one, you probably started writing a new novel. So this is only natural because your brain kind of works that way. You're kind of trained to think about long form content. Short stories, they are not the type of media that we're used to, so it makes sense that it actually takes some practice to get into the rhythm, get into the structure, get into what a short story is actually supposed to be. It's gonna be difficult to start, but don't worry, I've got your back. I am here. I will be your coach for short stories in this video. So let's get to it. Okay, we're gonna start by talking a little bit about what actually a short story is. What makes a short story? How long is a short story? What should you be aiming to do in a short story? So let's break it down and let's start by the basics. There are a couple of things to consider. The word count of your short story. I actually recommend keeping your word count as short as possible to train yourself to write flash fiction. Now, flash fiction is a sort of subcategory of short stories. Flash fiction usually ranges from, 2 words to, I would say, I think this differs depending on who you ask, but I would say flash fiction is probably up to about 2,000 words, maybe 1,000. I feel like at that point you're already transcending into short story territory. Not intended to rhyme, but I'm glad that it did. So short stories, they'll usually go from about 2,000 words to about, I think 10 to 15,000. I think 15 to 20,000 can already be considered a novella, which is like a short novel. But the first piece of advice I'll give you is to actually start practicing by doing flash fiction, because flash fiction is actually a lot harder to pull off than short story. And the reason you want to practice with this is because flash fiction is more like writing a scene. Think about a very, very tiny moment that you want to capture and write it as a scene, and see whether it would make sense to stand on its own. That's how you practice it. Now, you might be wondering,
who the hell is Shar
to tell us about short stories? Well, I've actually written quite a few. Some of you might not know this, but I do write a lot of short stories. Not willingly, actually. It's just something that we do at university, so I've kind of gotten into the habit of doing them every so often. We'll actually have them for homework every week, so we do little flash fiction pieces, and I've probably written about a dozen maybe flash fiction pieces, and I've also written a couple of longer short stories of about 3,000 to 4,000 words. So I do actually know what I'm talking about. Plus I got distinction grades on them, so just throwing that in there. But the first thing that we're gonna start with is thinking of how do you actually differentiate between an idea for a novel versus an idea for a short story. How does that work? How do we figure out what idea we have would fit into a short story versus what idea would fit into an actual long form novel? Now, a lot of people might just tell you it's about the size of your idea. Do you have a big idea? Do you have a small idea? However, I would encourage you not to think that way, because you might have a big complex world, but it might actually fit the setting of a short story. Or not every novel needs to have a massive big idea or a massive big plot line or this big complex world with a lot of subplots and a lot of plot twists and whatnot. That doesn't make for a huge novel. A huge novel can be super simple. It can have one character who's guiding the story, the one single plot line. It doesn't have to be a huge big thing. So instead of thinking about the size of your idea, try to think about the length of the journey that you're taking this particular character on. You want to stay within one specific pivotal moment for this character whose story you're telling. So what do I mean by one pivotal moment? It's like the most important moment in that person's life and then putting that on paper and telling your readers how that moment changed them. Now, I would say this is probably the biggest difference between novels and short stories. So in novels, your character is going to go through a whole journey of change. So it's not just going to be one event that made them change. It's going to be accumulation of things. It's going to be a sequence of events. It's going to be all these things that kind of piled up and led to that change. It led to them kind of being enlightened or figuring themselves out or figuring out what it was that they needed. Now, for a short story, it's just going to be the one event. So all your characters are going to need is this one thing to happen, this one thing to prompt their change. So basically, the way you can tell whether your idea is a short story idea or a novel idea is thinking about the change that happens in your character. Does this change require several different events to happen in order for your character to actually realize they need to change? Or is it just one tiny fraction of a moment that they experience that prompts this enlightenment, that prompts some kind of change in their life, that prompts them to take some kind of action? This is how you will realize whether your idea fits into a novel or just a short story. A lot of people make the mistake of starting to write their short stories and then going on to expand them into novels because they simply can't let go of the characters. They just can't let go of something that they've created. And that's totally fine. Like, that's totally understandable. I've definitely done that before. Why does this happen and how can you stop doing that? Because sometimes it's enough to just write a short story and let it be a short story. So I want to encourage you to think a little bit about your mindset. Like, what is it that's making you want to expand this idea that you had into a long form novel? And do you think you actually have the material to do that? If you write a really good short story and you're like super proud of it, oftentimes that's not gonna be enough to warrant you going off and writing a whole novel from the short story. The reason for that is because you chose that one pivotal moment. That's kind of what the magic boils down to, is this one pivotal moment and the one thing that happens. And if you try to expand that into a story that's longer, you might end up just watering it down. You might end up literally thinning out the plot that you created that would have worked magnificently as a short story. And instead you pushed it out into a novel and then you lost the plot. But anyway, this is just a mistake that I want you to be aware of when you start writing a story and you feel like you've done a really good job for a short story. That's great. Just stop there. Don't keep going. Now, let me just digress a little bit and answer a question that I feel like floats around a lot, and I see it a lot. And a lot of people come to my page because I actually do these monthly sort of story prompts. Like, I do short story prompts so you can have a writing plan and you can start writing short stories every month and whatnot. And we've been doing this for about a year or so, and it's been really popular with our users. So what I've noticed as like a trend in the comments and people who come and they do these short story challenges, they'll do them because they think they need to have written a short story before they can actually complete a novel. This isn't true. You don't have to have written any short stories beforehand. If you are attempting a long form project, it doesn't mean that you need to have completed a short form project or that you need to use short stories as practice. Don't get me wrong, they're great as practice and you should be writing as much as you possibly can. And if you are the type of person that really enjoys writing short stories, do that. Like 100% is great for practice. But short form and long form are not the same thing. So you don't have to be doing one to be able to do the other. You can just go into a long form project without having ever sniffed at or completed a short story or even wanted to complete a short story. You really don't need to do that. So if that's the reason you're at this video, I am giving you an excuse. I am saying you don't need to do this. If you feel like you're just here because you want to learn how to write a short story so you can say that you've completed one so that you can go on and do your long form project, stop procrastinating and just go write your long form project right now. actually finish watching this video first and then go. However, if you do want to write a short story and you're kind of struggling, you don't know where to start, you don't know how to do it, I'm gonna go over a couple of things with you just now. For a short story, you might be wondering what exactly is the structure inside a short story, because you know when you start writing a long form project, it's very clear. You have all these structures, you know, you have your 3-act structure, you have your 5-act structure, you have your hero's journey, you have this, you have that. But for short stories, it seems to be very convoluted and no one actually has like a clear answer for you. But it is actually quite simple. You don't necessarily have to stress about it too much, but you can also use a very simple 3-act structure for your short stories as well. So you don't have to think about it too hard. You just have your beginning, you have your middle, and you have your end. The way that this works is obviously you're just choosing one moment that changed a person's life. What that moment is going to be is your middle. That moment is your middle, it's your midpoint, if you will, of your short story. And all you have to think about in terms of the rest of the story is your setup and your resolution. So you'll give us a little bit of what led up to this moment, this one pivotal moment that we have been talking about. Then once this moment happens, you can give us a little bit about what follows. What's the resolution? How does the character change? What do they do when this thing happens to them? That's gonna be your end. Sometimes you don't even need these 3 parts. You can use 2. Like, you literally don't need to have the beginning, middle, and end. You can just have the beginning and the middle, or you can have the middle and the end. If you want to jump straight into the event, the pivotal moment of this person's life, feel free to do so. And then all you have to do is kind of sprinkle in a little bit of the setup, a little bit about who the character is and why it's important that this has happened to them specifically, and how does it affect them specifically. And then you can just move into the resolution of how it changed them, what it meant to them this moment, what they did about it, etc., etc. Also, the same way, you can kind of use the middle or this pivotal moment as the ending as well. So you could have a slightly longer setup and let us get to know who this character is, what they're struggling with, or you know, what their day-to-day looks like, and then introduce this life-changing moment as your middle. And once you do that, you don't necessarily need to resolve it either. You can leave it open-ended and you can let your reader wonder. Some short stories work really well that way, if you literally just tell us who the character is and what happens to them, and from the things that we've learned about the character so far, we can kind of conclude what the ending is, or we can kind of make up our own ending, and that way you're kind of letting the reader be an active participant in your story. So that's another way that you can try to structure the story. Just see whatever comes natural to this plot point, and then you don't necessarily have to force it to be any certain structure. Now that you know how to structure your short story, I'm gonna talk a little bit about what you actually need to include in the short story. You might have watched my first video and you'll see that I talk all about how plot doesn't matter. And yes, I still stand by that. What you want first and foremost for your short story is a character. And you don't want to go into it with too many characters. You want to be following one character, and you want to be following that one moment that changed their life. You do not have time in a short story to go into 2 point of views.
Unless you have this crazy, amazing idea.
And you know exactly how you want to pull it off. I would suggest sticking to 1 point of view and 1 character and 1 plot point, 1 thing that happens to that character. You can take your time to explore who that character is or how they get to that 1 plot point, but don't try to shove in too many sequences. Don't try to shove in too many events or too much plot. Short stories are not about plot. I could personally argue that nothing really is about plot, but I'm not going to get into that. You can watch this video if you want to know more about why I think plot doesn't matter. But for short stories specifically, you definitely want to be starting from a character and something that happened to that character. And you want to be starting from the reason that you're writing this short story. So every short story should have a very clear story question. This means that you're asking something that you want to explore throughout this little piece that you wrote, and you want to explore through these characters that you've created specifically to answer this story question. I'm going to give you an example from one of my own recent short stories that I wrote called Ode to an Island. The question that I was asking throughout this story was, can you keep your own passions inside of a relationship? Can you still have your individualist beliefs while in a relationship with someone else? That was the question that I was asking with the story, and I was very clear on what that question was, and I knew exactly what I wanted the answer to be. I knew I wanted to say that sometimes it's more important to put yourself as an individual ahead of a relationship, or that sometimes, you know, relationships can be suffocating and they might push you into a box in which you cannot express yourself. So this was the sort of the story question that I was personally going for, and the entire story led up to that question. And that was the whole idea behind it. And both of the characters I created, that's right, I only had 2 characters in the whole story. Both of them were there for a reason. So one of them represented the relationship, one of them represented duality, companionship, and then the other one represented individuality. She represented the person that was strong, that had strong beliefs as an individual, and she couldn't bring those into a relationship. So this was kind of what the whole story was about. It was about the clash of those 2 personalities. It was told from one person's point of view, focused on one plot point, one big thing, and it didn't go into too many sequences. It didn't have too much setup. It didn't have too much resolution. The resolution was quite abrupt. You kind of make your point and then you leave it at that. You don't necessarily have to over explain anything in a short story, as long as you answer your question, or as long as you at least ask the question. As long as your reader knows what the point of the story is, you're good. You don't have to go into over explanation. So to sum up, what do you actually need when writing a short story? First of all, you need a story question. It needs to be one question. It needs to be very clear. You need to know the answer to the question, and you need to know why you're asking the question. Number 2, you need a character. You need a character designed specifically to answer that question. It could be in opposition to the question that you're asking, or they could be the representation of the question that you're asking. But you want this character to carry that question within them, and you want them to be almost the device that finds the answer for you. Number 3, you need one plot point which is surrounded by the setup and the resolution of that plot point, though you don't necessarily need to have all 3. Now, what I want you to keep in mind as you go on and you go and write your short story is that you want to start very much from your character and very much from what that character needs to realize. Now, if you want a little bit more about this and why this is important and why your concept and your plot, well, your concept's going to be important, but your plot is not necessarily going to be that important, you can have a look at my last video just right here. Find out a little bit more about why plot doesn't actually matter. All right, that's it for this video. Thank you so much for tuning in. Leave a like if you enjoyed and a comment if you have anything to add to the discussion or any of your own short story tips that you would like to share with other writers. You can just leave them below. Yeah, I will catch you on the flip side. Bye.